He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just picked up his coffee mug, said goodbye to no one in particular, and walked out of a job he'd held for 6 years. Because a woman who'd been CEO for 11 weeks decided his tardiness was a fireable offense. What Victoria Sterling didn't know was that Ethan Mercer had been late that morning because his 8-year-old daughter had grabbed his sleeve in the school parking lot and whispered, "Daddy, please don't go yet." And what Ethan didn't know was that before the night was over, that same woman would be standing in the rain on a deserted highway, and he would be the only one who stopped. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The school parking lot smelled like wet asphalt and someone's forgotten lunch, and Ethan Mercer was already 12 minutes behind schedule when Lily grabbed his hand and refused to let go. 5 more minutes, she said. Not begging exactly. More like stating a fact she expected the universe to honor. Ethan looked at his watch, then at his daughter. She was wearing the yellow rain boots he'd bought 2 sizes too big so she could grow into them, and her hair was coming loose from the braid he'd done himself that morning. Badly, as always, little flyaways going in every direction because he still hadn't figured out how to do a proper French braid, no matter how many YouTube videos he watched. She was looking up at him with those wide brown eyes that were her mother's eyes, the exact same shape and color, and for a second he just stood there in the school parking lot like an idiot, forgetting entirely that he had somewhere to be. "Lily," he said. "Baby, I have work." "I know." She didn't loosen her grip. 5 minutes. The morning had been one of those school events, a father-daughter breakfast thing the PTA organized twice a year, little folding tables set up in the gymnasium with orange juice and paper cups and pancakes made by parent volunteers. Ethan had taken half a vacation day to be there, something he almost never did, because Lily had circled the date on the kitchen calendar in red marker 3 weeks in advance and drawn a small star next to it. He'd sat across from her at one of those tiny tables designed for 8-year-olds, his knees practically at his chin, eating pancakes that were somehow simultaneously burnt and undercooked, and he'd watched his daughter talk for 45 minutes straight about her class hamster named Professor Buttons, about a book she was reading, about how her best friend Maya had taught her to whistle, but she still couldn't do it right. He'd listened to every word. Now she didn't want him to leave. He crouched down so they were eye level, which put him at approximately the height of a garden gnome in that parking lot, and he said, "I'll be at the front door when school gets out, right at the door." "Promise?" "Promise." She thought about this. "Okay." Then she hugged him, hard, the way kids hug when they really mean it, both arms tight around his neck. He held on a few extra seconds, breathed in the smell of her shampoo and that weird grape-scented eraser she'd had in her pocket for 2 months. Then he stood up, waved goodbye 3 separate times because she kept turning around to check, got in his truck, and drove 17 miles over the speed limit for most of the 30-minute commute to Caldwell Logistics headquarters. He walked through the lobby at 9:47 a.m., 47 minutes late. The thing about Caldwell Logistics was that it was not, by any objective measure, a warm place to work. The building itself was fine, glass and steel, decent coffee machine in the break room, functional if uninspiring. But there was a particular quality to the air inside it, something pressurized, like a cabin at altitude. People spoke in careful, measured tones. They smiled when they needed to and stopped when they didn't. It was the kind of company that had been run by men in their 60s for most of its 40-year history, and it had developed the culture to match. Hierarchical, self-serious, deeply uncomfortable with anything that disrupted the established order. Ethan Mercer disrupted nothing. That was part of why he'd lasted 6 years. He was head of logistics coordination for the Eastern Distribution Network, which was a title that sounded more impressive than it was. What it meant in practice was that he spent his days managing the flow of freight contracts through a spiderweb of regional hubs, coordinating with drivers and warehouse supervisors and client representatives, and quietly fixing the problems that other people's poor planning created. He was good at it. Not brilliantly good, not the kind of good that got you profiled in trade magazines, but the steady, reliable kind of good that kept things running without anyone having to think much about it. He'd come to Caldwell 6 years ago, after leaving the Army. He didn't talk about the Army much. He'd done 2 tours, come back in one piece more or less, and found civilian life profoundly, almost humorously disorienting. The military had been about clarity. Here's the mission, here are the parameters, this is what success looks like. Civilian work involved a lot more ambiguity and a lot more meetings that could have been emails. His wife, Claire, had helped him adjust. Claire had been practical in the way that genuinely practical people are, without making a performance of it. She'd simply figured out what needed doing and done it, and she'd helped Ethan do the same. When she got sick, a diagnosis that came out of nowhere on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday, the kind of Tuesday where you're planning what to have for dinner, and your whole life pivots on a word. She'd handled that with the same straightforward approach. She didn't dwell. She focused on what she could control. She died when Lily was 3. Lily didn't really remember her. That was the part that gutted Ethan when he let himself think about it, which he tried not to do because there was no productive end to that line of thought. You couldn't fix it. You just carried it. So he carried it, and he raised his daughter, and he went to work, and he did his job, and on the mornings when Lily's hair came out of the braid, and her lunch wasn't packed, and he spilled coffee on his sleeve at 7:15 a.m., and the commute took 10 minutes longer than it should have, he showed up anyway. He was late twice in the past 3 years, both times for Lily-related reasons, both times for less than 30 minutes. He'd never missed a deadline. He'd never lost a contract. He'd covered for colleagues during their personal crises without being asked and without mentioning it afterward. He was not, by any reasonable definition, the kind of employee you fire. He made it to his desk, logged in, started going through his emails, and was about 40 minutes into his morning when Marcus Webb appeared at the edge of his cubicle. Marcus was one of the junior coordinators, 26 years old, still learning, good instincts, a little too eager to please people he perceived as above him. "Hey," Marcus said, and there was something in the way he said it, careful, like he was choosing a path through ice, that made Ethan look up. "Morales wants you in the conference room." Diane Morales was the HR director. The conference room on the second floor was where HR held the conversations that didn't happen at someone's desk. "Now?" Ethan said. "Yeah." Marcus wouldn't quite meet his eyes. "Sorry, man." Ethan saved what he was working on, pushed back his chair, and went upstairs. The conference room had that particular stillness that rooms get when people have been waiting in them, that overworked air quality. Diane Morales was there, sitting with her hands folded on the table, her expression professionally neutral. And there, standing at the window with her arms crossed and her back half turned to the room, was the woman Ethan had seen a handful of times in the 3 months since she'd taken over as CEO, Victoria Sterling. She was younger than you expected a CEO to be, and she had the kind of presence that people in business school probably worked very hard to cultivate, and she'd apparently just been born with, still, contained, intensely attentive in a way that made you feel like every word you said was being silently filed away somewhere. When she turned, she looked at Ethan for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Mr. Mercer, sit down." He sat. She remained standing. In Ethan's experience, this was a deliberate choice, keeping the height advantage. He noted it without particular feeling. "We have a problem," she said. "Okay," he said. "This is the 3rd time in the past month you've arrived late." She said it flatly, like reading from a document. For an employee in a coordination role, where your availability affects the entire Eastern Hub's morning operations, that's not acceptable. Ethan blinked. He kept his voice calm. "I think there may be a misunderstanding. I've been late twice in the past 3 years. Today was... The records show 3 incidents in the past month alone." She glanced down at something, a tablet, or a printed page he couldn't tell from where he was sitting. "I've reviewed them personally." He sat with that for a moment. Something was wrong, but he couldn't identify the shape of it yet, and this was not the moment to argue. He said, "I've been late twice in 3 years. Today was for my daughter's school event. I can show you my time logs. The logs I've reviewed tell a different story." "Then the logs are wrong." There was a silence. Diane Morales was looking at the table. Victoria Sterling was looking at Ethan, and he could see her processing something, some calculation running behind her eyes. But whatever it was, it didn't change the outcome she'd apparently already decided on before he walked in the room. "I want to be direct with you," she said. "This company is in a transition period. The Eastern Hub is critical to our restructuring plan. I need people in key coordination roles who are reliable, who are present, who..." "I'm reliable," Ethan said, still calm. "I've been here 6 years. My performance reviews are..." "I understand you feel that way." There it was. The corporate speak, the slight tonal shift that turned a person into a category. I understand you feel that way. Like his perspective was a weather pattern she was acknowledging, rather than information she was considering. But based on what I've reviewed, I don't think this position is the right fit for you moving forward. Another silence. Ethan said, "You're firing me." "We're letting you go," Diane Morales said, the HR version of the same thing. He sat there for another few seconds. He thought about the time logs and wondered, with a strange, detached clarity, who had altered them and why. He thought about Lily waiting for him at the school door at 3 o'clock, trusting that he'd be there. He thought about 6 years of showing up, of missing holidays to cover emergencies, of solving problems at 11 at night because nobody else was available. He thought about Claire and what she would tell him to do. She'd tell him to stand up straight and get out of the room without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing him crack. He stood up. "I'll need 30 minutes to clear my desk," he said. Victoria Sterling looked at him, really looked at him, like something had snagged on her attention. And for just a moment her composure shifted, something uncertain moving beneath the surface of her expression. "Of course," she said. He nodded at Diane, nodded at the CEO, and walked out. He did not slam the door. He didn't make a scene at his desk. He packed his mug, the photo of Lily he kept next to his monitor, and a small wooden carving of a fox that Lily had painted for him the previous Christmas, its ears slightly uneven and its tail a confident shade of orange. He said goodbye to Marcus, who looked so stricken with second-hand guilt that Ethan almost felt bad for him. He said goodbye to a couple of other people he'd worked alongside for years, brief and low-key, the way he preferred things. He drove out of the parking garage at 10:43 a.m. He picked Lily up at 3 p.m., exactly as he'd promised, right at the front door. She didn't notice anything was wrong until they got home. She looked at him sideways while they were making sandwiches for dinner. He'd planned to cook something real, but he wasn't quite up to it, and she said, "Daddy, you look tired." "Yeah," he said, "little bit." "Like sad tired or sick tired?" He looked at her. He said, "Just processing stuff tired. You know how sometimes you have to think about something before you know what you think about it?" She considered this. "Like when Maya was mean to me on the swings and I didn't cry until I got home?" "Exactly like that." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and ate half her sandwich and talked about Professor Button some more. When she was in bed that night, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and tried to figure out what came next. He had savings. Not a lot, but enough for a few months if he was careful. He had Lily's school costs locked in through the end of the year. He had, if he was being honest, probably better qualifications than he'd ever really leveraged, because he'd never needed to. He'd been comfortable where he was, comfortable in the steadiness of it. He sat with the cold coffee, and he thought about what he would do, and he thought about the CEO's face in that conference room, the way she'd looked at him when he stood up, like she'd been about to say something else and stopped herself. Then he cleaned up, set the alarm for 6, and went to bed. Victoria Sterling was still at the office at 9:30 that night. This was not unusual. Since taking over as CEO 3 months ago, she'd developed the habit of staying until the building was almost empty, because it was the only time the noise died down enough to think clearly. The noise was not volume, Caldwell's offices were never loud, but density. The density of everyone watching her, calibrating her, looking for evidence that confirmed whatever they'd already decided to believe about her. She was 30 years old. The board had appointed her because her performance at the subsidiary level had been exceptional, because the former CEO had recommended her specifically, and because, she was not unaware of this, she was the kind of choice that looked good in a press release during a particular moment in business culture. She was fine with that. She knew what the game was. She was also genuinely good at her job, and she was determined to prove it in ways that couldn't be attributed to aesthetics or optics. The problem was that everyone was waiting for her to fail. Not overtly. Nobody said it to her face, obviously, but she could feel it in the room whenever she walked into a meeting with the senior leadership team. That quality of careful attention, men who had been at this company for 15 or 20 years, men who smiled and nodded and undermined her in the 3 minutes between meetings when they thought she wasn't paying attention. Richard Hale was the one she found hardest to read. Senior VP of Operations, 22 years at Caldwell, the kind of man who had the organization's institutional memory living in his head and who knew exactly how valuable that made him. He was always helpful. He always had the file she needed, the context she was missing, the name of the person to call. He'd walked her through the Eastern Hub's restructuring plan with the patience of someone who genuinely wanted her to succeed, and when she'd asked him about the coordinator who'd been racking up tardiness incidents, he'd sighed in a way that communicated deep, reluctant regret. Ethan Mercer, he'd said. Good man, actually, or he used to be. But the attendance issues have been escalating, and honestly, with the restructuring contract coming up, you can't afford soft spots in the Eastern Hub. She'd reviewed the records he'd pulled. 3 incidents in the past month, all logged, time-stamped. She'd made the call. Now, sitting alone in her office at 9:30, she turned the conversation over in her mind and found herself stuck on the same moment, the same detail, no matter how many times she replayed it. Then the logs are wrong. He'd said it quietly, without heat. Not defensively, not desperately. Just stating a fact, the way you state facts, when you're certain of them, and you don't have time to argue because the outcome is already decided. He hadn't tried to talk his way out of it. He hadn't offered explanations or excuses. He'd pushed back on one specific verifiable claim. The logs are wrong. And when she hadn't engaged with it, he'd simply stood up. He'd been dignified about it. That was the word she kept coming back to, and it bothered her, because dignity in the face of injustice was either the posture of someone who had nothing to hide and knew the truth would eventually bear them out, or it was the last resource of someone who'd already calculated that arguing was pointless. Both of those interpretations were uncomfortable. She pulled up his personnel file on her computer. 6 years. 2 previous late arrivals, both over a year ago, both within acceptable windows by any metric she could identify. Annual performance reviews, she clicked through to the written evaluations, were consistently strong. His direct supervisors had used words like reliable, unflappable, the person you call when something's going wrong. There was a commendation from the client at the Memphis Hub, dated 18 months ago, crediting his work with saving a contract that had been on the verge of collapse. She sat back in her chair. She thought, I looked at the wrong records. She thought, Richard pulled those records. And then her phone pinged. A weather alert, flash flood conditions on the Eastern Highway corridor. And she looked at the time, saw how late it had gotten, and started gathering her things to leave. The storm came fast. By the time Victoria made it to the parking garage and got in her car, the rain was coming down hard enough that she could barely see the exit ramp. She sat for a few minutes, waiting for it to ease, checking her phone, reading the weather alerts that were updating every few minutes. Flash flood watch. Road conditions deteriorating. She had 25 miles to cover to get back to her apartment. She drove anyway. This was, in retrospect, a bad decision, but she was Victoria Sterling, and bad decisions were something that happened to other people because other people didn't plan well, and she did. And also it felt undignified to be trapped in a parking garage by weather. She made it 11 miles before her SUV started behaving strangely. A shimmy in the steering, something wrong with the traction. And another mile after that before she lost control briefly, corrected, and managed to coast to the shoulder of the highway, where she stopped with her hazard lights on, and her heart moving faster than she would have preferred. She sat there for a moment, breathing. The rain hammered the roof of the car. In the bright flicker of her hazard lights, she could see the highway in front of her, the wet reflections of lane markings, the tire tracks already filling with water. She called roadside assistance. The estimated wait time was 90 minutes, possibly more given current road conditions. She called a ride service. Nobody was accepting requests in the area. She sat in the car and watched cars pass her. Not slow, not a parade of them, but a steady enough stream that she was not invisible, not stranded somewhere genuinely remote. She sat and watched them go past, one by one, none of them stopping, and she did not think about Ethan Mercer because she refused to let that particular parallel develop in her brain. 20 minutes passed. 30. She was composing a text to her assistant about backup transportation options when she saw the headlights. Big truck, coming slow. Slowing more. Moving toward the shoulder. A pickup truck, not new. A few dents she could see even in the rain, pulled up ahead of her hazard lights and stopped. The driver's door opened and someone got out and walked back toward her in the rain, no umbrella, hands in jacket pockets, not hurrying but moving with purpose. And it wasn't until she had manually rolled down her window halfway, the automatic function was apparently part of whatever had gone wrong with the car, that she saw his face in the reflected light of her own headlights. She stared at him. He stared at her. The rain came down between them. Ethan Mercer said, "Ms. Sterling." Not a question, not warm, just factual, in the same tone he'd used in the conference room, the same levelness. She said, and she hated herself slightly for the way it came out. Too revealing, too close to an emotion. What are you doing here? Same highway, he said. I live 20 miles up. He nodded toward the car. What happened? I don't know. Steering went wrong. She caught herself. You don't have to stop. I have roadside assistance coming. How long? 90 minutes. He looked up and down the highway. The rain was intensifying again. 90 minutes in this. It wasn't a judgment, just an assessment. He looked back at her. I can take you somewhere. She should have said no. There were probably 15 practical reasons to say no. She said, I don't want to impose. You're stranded on a highway in a flood watch, he said. Getting you somewhere safe isn't an imposition. It's just the thing to do. He said it like it was genuinely that simple, and like he wasn't even slightly aware of the irony of him saying it to her. She got out of the car, too. The pickup truck was warm inside, which she hadn't expected, and slightly cluttered in the way vehicles become when they belong to people with complicated lives. A gym bag on the floor of the passenger side, a water bottle in the cup holder, a child's drawing folded up on the dashboard. She buckled in and he went around to the driver's side and got in, and the rain was loud on the roof, and that was when she saw the small figure in the back seat. The little girl was asleep. She was maybe 7 or 8, curled on her side against the back seat with a jacket tucked around her. His jacket, Victoria realized, because he was wearing only a work shirt despite having been standing in the rain, and her mouth was slightly open and her hair was coming out of a braid in every direction. Victoria looked at the child for a long moment without speaking. Ethan checked his mirrors and pulled back onto the highway, slow and careful, reading the surface of the road. The way you do when you've driven in conditions like this enough times that the caution is automatic rather than thought about. She was at a friend's house, he said quietly, nodding toward the back seat. Lily. She's asleep, Victoria said, like that wasn't obvious, like she needed to say something. Yeah, she sleeps hard. There was something in the way he said it. Not sentimental, not performative, just the simple truth of knowing a person thoroughly. She could sleep through a fire alarm. They drove in silence for a while. The highway was mostly empty now, other cars having apparently made smarter decisions about the weather. Ethan kept to a careful speed, both hands on the wheel, eyes steady on the road ahead. Victoria said, Are you going out of your way? A little. You should tell me where to drop me. I'll take you home. Where do you live? She hesitated. He glanced at her sideways. I'm not going to do anything, he said, and there was a flatness to it that made her feel slightly absurd for hesitating. I'm just asking so I know where to go. She gave him her address. He adjusted the GPS on his phone, attached to the dash, and they went back to silence. It was not, as silences went, an angry one. Or if there was anger in it, it was the kind that had already been processed, acknowledged, set down somewhere out of reach. What she could feel from him was more like tiredness, the thorough tiredness of someone who has been holding things up for a long time without anyone noticing. I want to apologize, she said. He didn't respond immediately. A few seconds passed. You reviewed records that someone else pulled, he said, not exonerating her, just locating the facts. Yes. And you made a decision based on those records. Yes. And you didn't verify them. Still not angry, just precise. She said, No, I didn't. Another silence. In the back seat, Lily shifted slightly, pulling the jacket more tightly around herself. I'm not looking for an apology tonight, he said finally. Tonight I'm driving home. If you want to talk about what happened, that's a conversation for another time, in an appropriate setting. He paused. If you believe the records were wrong, I think they were. He nodded. Didn't say anything. She sat in the passenger seat of his truck and watched him drive, hands steady, speed steady, eyes calm. And she thought about the Ethan Mercer she'd read about in those performance reviews, the person you call when something's going wrong, and she thought about the man in that conference room who had not once raised his voice or made her feel attacked, who had stood up with complete composure and walked out of his job of 6 years, and then, the same night she'd fired him, had pulled over on a flooded highway to help the woman who'd done it. She didn't understand him yet, but she was beginning to think she'd made a very significant mistake. They pulled up to her building 40 minutes later. The rain had settled into something steadier and quieter, no longer the violent downpour it had been. Ethan left the truck running, the heater on for Lily. "There's a code for the parking structure," Victoria started. "I'll just pull up to the door," he said. "You'll be fine from there." She got out. Then, without quite planning to, she turned back. He had his window down, one arm resting on the edge. She said, "Ethan." She'd used his first name without thinking about it. "I'm going to look into what happened, the actual records, I promise you that." He looked at her for a moment. Whatever he was feeling, he kept it behind something measured and contained. "Good night, Ms. Sterling," he said. She watched the truck pull away from the curb. In the back window, she could just make out the small shape of Lily, still sleeping, jacket still tucked around her, completely unaware of the strange and broken evening that had just unfolded around her. Victoria stood on the wet sidewalk in front of her building, still wearing Ethan's jacket. She hadn't even realized she'd kept it, and made herself a promise she intended to keep. She went inside. On the elevator up to her floor, she typed a reminder into her phone. Employment records, Eastern Hub. Cross-reference raw system logs. First thing tomorrow. She thought about his face in the parking lot of the school that morning. She hadn't been there, hadn't seen any of that, but she could construct it now from the pieces she had. The little girl who didn't want him to leave. The father who stayed 5 more minutes because she asked. The 47 minutes of lateness that had looked like negligence and had been, in fact, exactly the opposite. She'd made a mistake, a real one, with weight and consequence. Tomorrow she would start figuring out exactly how bad it was. The jacket was still on her couch when she woke up. It was the first thing she saw when she came out of the bedroom at 5:40 in the morning, before the coffee was made, before she'd fully assembled herself into the version of Victoria Sterling that the world was permitted to see. Just a plain dark jacket, a little worn at the cuffs, folded over the arm of the couch, where she'd put it the night before and forgotten. She stood there for a moment in her kitchen doorway looking at it like it was evidence of something. She made coffee, she showered, she put on a suit that cost more than Ethan Mercer's monthly truck payment, and told herself that was not a thought she needed to be having. She was in the office by 6:50. Her assistant, Priya, arrived at 7:30 and found Victoria already 3 hours deep into Caldwell's employee records system, cross-referencing timestamp logs from the security badge database against the attendance records that Richard Hale had placed in front of her the previous morning. Priya was 24, competent, and had learned very quickly that Victoria had 2 modes in the morning, focused and very focused, and that the appropriate response to either was to bring coffee, say nothing, and wait to be spoken to. She brought coffee, said nothing, waited. Victoria said, without looking up from her screen, "I need it to pull the raw access logs for the Eastern Hub coordinator team, going back 6 months. The actual server-side logs, not the HR interface version. I need them to come directly to me." Priya wrote this down. "Timeline? This morning. I'll call them now. And I need the original unedited versions of all attendance records flagged in the last 30 days for that team. Tell them I want the edit history, if there is one, timestamps on any modifications." Priya paused for just a fraction of a second, the pause of someone who understood the implication, and then wrote that down too. "I'll get started. Thank you." The door clicked shut. Victoria turned back to her screen. Here was the thing about raw data. It didn't have opinions. It didn't have an agenda. It recorded what happened in the sequence that it happened, and it sat there holding that information with total indifference, waiting for someone to ask the right question. What Victoria had asked, and what the data was now answering with growing clarity, was simple. Did Ethan Mercer's security badge record match the attendance record she'd been shown? It did not. His badge had swiped in on the days marked as absences. The timestamps were clear. More than that. And this was where it got interesting in a way that turned her stomach. The attendance records she'd reviewed had been modified. Not created incorrectly. Modified. There were edit timestamps on 3 entries, all within a 48-hour window, all made from a workstation registered to a user account in the senior leadership tier. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Diane Morales. Diane answered on the second ring, which meant she was already at her desk, which was typical for Diane, who arrived early and stayed late and maintained throughout all of it a kind of professional serenity that Victoria had always found faintly impressive. "Victoria," Diane said. "Good morning." "Good morning. I need to ask you something directly." A brief pause. Of course. When Richard brought me the attendance records for Ethan Mercer, were you in that conversation? Another pause, slightly longer. He shared them with me the morning before your meeting, yes. Did you pull those records yourself, or did he send them to you? He sent them to me. The pause that followed had a different quality to it. Not hesitation, so much as careful assembly. Victoria, is there a problem? Potentially a significant one. She kept her voice measured. I'm going to need your personnel file access frozen for the Eastern Hub team pending an IT audit. Please don't discuss that with anyone else at this point. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then, understood. I'll action that now. Thank you, Diane. She hung up and sat very still, staring at her screen, at the perfectly clear, perfectly damning edit. Timestamps arranged in a column on the left side of the attendance record. Ethan Mercer had not been late 3 times in the past month. He had been late once, yesterday morning, for 47 minutes, because his daughter had grabbed his hand in a school parking lot. Somebody had changed the records to make it look otherwise. Somebody who had a workstation in the senior leadership tier. Somebody who had handed her those records personally, with an expression of deep and reluctant concern. She picked up her pen, turned to a legal pad, and wrote Richard Hale's name at the top of a page that would eventually become very long. She didn't tell anyone else what she was doing. Not yet. She needed to understand the full shape of it before she did anything irreversible. And she was uncomfortably aware that she had already done one irreversible thing that she would have to answer for. The IT logs arrived by 9:15. She went through them methodically, the way she'd learned to go through financial data. Not looking for something specific, just reading, letting the patterns surface. The modifications to Ethan's records were there, exactly where the attendance file had suggested, made at 6:43 p.m. 2 days ago, from a workstation registered to the senior VP account. She kept reading. By 11, she'd found something else. A series of internal emails from 3 weeks earlier, routed through a distribution list she wasn't on, discussing the timeline of the Eastern Hub restructuring contract and the need to... The phrasing was careful, bureaucratic, the kind of careful that people deploy when they know what they're doing is wrong, but want paper that says otherwise. Reposition key personnel ahead of the transition phase. Reposition key personnel. She stared at that phrase for a long time. The restructuring contract for the Eastern Hub was worth, depending on which projection model you used, somewhere between $18 and $24 million over 3 years. The company handling the operational consulting for that restructuring had a board member who was a former colleague of Richard Hale's. She had not known this before. She knew it now because she'd spent 20 minutes that morning reading Richard's professional history on every platform she could access, because something Ethan had said in the truck, not with words, but with that particular quality of certainty in his voice when he said the logs are wrong, had stayed with her like a splinter. She didn't have everything yet. What she had was enough to know she needed more, and that getting more required moving carefully. Richard Hale had 22 years at this company. He had relationships she was still mapping. He had, she was increasingly certain, been one of the people most actively hoping she would fail fast enough, and comprehensively enough that the board would reconsider her appointment. Firing Ethan Mercer, a beloved 6-year employee with a spotless record, on the basis of falsified evidence had probably looked to whoever orchestrated it like a gift. Let the new CEO make a spectacular, indefensible mistake. Let her fire the wrong man. Let the story write itself. She had almost walked right into it. She pulled up Ethan's full personnel file again and read through it top to bottom, slowly, the way she should have read it before she'd made any decision at all. The performance reviews. The commendation from Memphis. A note from his previous supervisor, a man named Carroll who'd retired 2 years ago, that was more personal than professional notes usually were, the kind of thing that occasionally slipped through when a supervisor genuinely liked someone. Ethan is the kind of employee you build a team around. He doesn't ask for recognition, and he doesn't need it, which makes it easy to forget to give it. Don't forget. She read that line twice. Then she closed the file, picked up her phone, and texted Priya. Clear my afternoon. I need uninterrupted time. Across the city, Ethan was at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and his laptop open to a job search site that he'd been staring at for 30 minutes without clicking on anything. His resume was open in another tab. It was fine as resumes went. It was accurate. It listed his actual qualifications and his actual experience, and it was formatted in a way that was clear and professional, and he had never in his life felt less like he knew how to present himself in a document. He'd sent Lily to school that morning. She'd asked again if he was okay, in the way she did, sideways, indirect, watching him from under her lashes while she ate her cereal. And he told her again that he was fine, just thinking about things. She'd accepted this with the pragmatic grace that 8-year-olds sometimes had about adult complications, which was to say she'd moved on to talking about the art project they were doing in class, something involving papier-mâché and considerably more enthusiasm than the situation probably warranted. He'd dropped her off, come home, made coffee, and now he was sitting here. He was not someone who fell apart. That was not, to his knowledge, something he was capable of. He'd been through things that made losing a job look like losing a parking spot, and he'd come through them intact, more or less. But there was something particular about this that was harder to shake than he'd expected. Not the injustice of it exactly, though that was there too, but the specific quality of the injustice. That someone had lied. That someone had gone out of their way to construct something false and hand it to a person with the power to hurt him, and that person had used it without checking. I was angry about that. He was allowing himself to be angry about it, which was something he'd learned was important. Not to perform it, not to let it drive decisions, but to feel it in full before letting it go. He thought about Victoria Sterling in the passenger seat of his truck, the rain loud on the roof, her professional composure fraying at the edges in ways she was visibly working to prevent. She'd been surprised. He could see that much. Not fake surprised, genuinely shaken, like someone who'd realized mid-step that the floor was not where she'd expected it to be. He didn't know what to do with that. He didn't know what she'd do with it either. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, local area code. He picked it up. Mercer. Mr. Mercer. A woman's voice, professional, youngish. My name is Priya Chandran. I'm the executive assistant to the CEO of Caldwell Logistics. Ms. Sterling asked me to reach out and arrange a time for her to speak with you. She said, a brief pause, like she was reading directly from a note. She said she wanted me to tell you that she has new information and that she would like to speak with you in person, if you're willing. Ethan was quiet for a moment. She can call me herself, he said. Another pause, shorter this time. Yes, of course. I'll let her know. He hung up and looked at his cold coffee. 4 minutes later, his phone buzzed again. Same number. He answered. Mr. Mercer. Victoria's voice. More contained than it had been in the truck. The professional wrapper back in place, but not completely. There was something underneath it that hadn't been there in the conference room yesterday morning. Thank you for taking my call. What's the new information? He said. Not unkindly, but not with warmth either. Just direct. She took a breath. I've been in the employment records since 6 this morning. The attendance logs that were presented to me were modified. Someone altered them in the 48 hours before our meeting. I have the edit timestamps and the workstation they originated from. He sat with that. Okay, he said. That's all you have to say? What would you like me to say? She was quiet for a second. He could almost hear her recalibrating. I suppose I expected, I don't know, more of a reaction. I already knew the records were wrong, he said. I told you that in the room. The reaction happened then. He paused. What are you going to do about it? I'm building a case, she said. I need a few days. I don't want to move until I have the full picture, because if I move too early and someone has time to cover tracks... I understand. I want to fix this, Ethan. His name, again, the first name, and he noted it. I want to be clear about that. What happened to you was wrong. It was my mistake, even if I was working with information someone else falsified. The responsibility still lands on me. He didn't say anything right away. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something. A car passed on the street. Small, ordinary sounds, the texture of a regular morning, the kind of morning he wasn't supposed to be having at home in the middle of a weekday. How long do you need? He said. A week, maybe less. All right. He stood up from the kitchen table, stretched his back. Don't call Priya next time. If you have something to tell me directly. A beat. Fair enough. Is there anything you need from me? Documents? Testimony? Not yet, but I'll let you know. Okay. He moved to pour the cold coffee down the sink. Victoria. Her name, reciprocal. He'd done it before he thought about it, and didn't apologize for it. Do this right. I intend to, she said, and for the first time since all of this started, he believed her. The week that followed was the strangest of Victoria's professional life, and she had had some genuinely strange weeks. She worked the case like a prosecutor building toward a trial, methodically, without showing her hand, keeping the circle of people who knew anything as small as possible. Priya knew some of it. Diane Morales, who turned out to be considerably more useful as an ally than Victoria had given her credit for, knew most of it. The IT director knew the technical scope of what she was asking for and was smart enough not to ask why. Richard Hale knew nothing, or rather, and this was the thing that kept her up past midnight most nights that week, he knew everything, and he simply did not know that she knew. He continued to be exactly what he had always been in her presence, smooth, helpful, faintly avuncular, the kind of man who held doors and remembered the names of your staff, and had 22 years of institutional memory arranged behind his eyes, like a weapons cache. She watched him differently now. She watched the specific things he chose to tell her and the specific things he didn't. She watched how he positioned himself in meetings, which conversations he arrived early for, which ones he left as soon as they were over. She'd been reading him wrong since she started. She'd been reading him as an ally, or at worst a neutral party, an elder statesman of the company who could have resented her appointment and had apparently chosen to be helpful instead. What he had actually been doing, she now understood, was managing her. He'd fed her information strategically. He'd framed situations in ways that benefited his preferred outcomes. And when she'd been new and overwhelmed and eager to demonstrate she could make hard calls without flinching, he'd handed her Ethan Mercer's falsified record and watched her pull the trigger on a man whose only offense was that he knew the Eastern Hub's operations well enough to recognize irregularities in the restructuring contract. Irregularities that would have channeled a substantial portion of the consulting fee to a firm in which Richard had a quiet financial interest. She found the financial connection on day 4. It was buried, as these things always were, but not buried well enough because Richard had apparently not anticipated someone looking for it. A consulting subcontract, 2 layers removed from the main agreement, routed through a holding company that was registered in a state with permissive disclosure laws, but that paid out quarterly to a private account she had to call in 2 favors to trace. When she traced it, she sat very still for about 3 minutes. Then she called a lawyer she trusted who wasn't on Caldwell's internal legal team. She'd been texting Ethan sporadically through the week. Not often. She was conscious of the awkwardness of it, the power differential that still technically existed, even though she'd effectively destroyed the professional relationship she'd had with him. But enough to keep him informed. Brief, direct messages. She kept them factual because she didn't know what else she could offer him at this point. Still building. Found a financial connection. Significant. His response, 3 minutes later. How significant? Significant enough to end careers. Okay? How's the case on the records? Solid. Edit trail is unambiguous. A pause. Then, good. Let me know if you need anything. She put her phone down and stared at the financial document spread across her desk. Then she picked it back up and typed, "How are you holding up?" Another pause, longer this time. Managing. Lily helped me repaint the front door yesterday. It's now extremely orange. She read that and felt something loosen slightly in her chest, some tight thing she'd been carrying since that conference room. She typed, "Orange was a bold choice. She picked the color. I'm not going to argue with her taste when she's the one doing the work." Victoria looked at that for a moment, at the specific texture of it, the dry humor, the understated love in it, and put her phone away before she could think of a response that was too much. On Thursday afternoon, she got a call from Tom Heller, a retired Army colonel who'd served alongside Ethan years earlier and had apparently heard through some network that Ethan was in trouble at work. She didn't know how he'd gotten her direct line, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Ms. Sterling," Heller said. He had a voice like a piece of furniture, solid, functional, not interested in being admired. "I'll keep this short. You fired Ethan Mercer this week." "That matter is under review," she said. "I know it is. I'm calling because I want to tell you something about the man, and I want you to hear it from someone who isn't trying to get anything from you." A pause. In 2009, Ethan Mercer pulled 2 men out of a vehicle that was on fire. He went back in twice. He came out the second time with burns on both forearms that took 4 months to heal, and he didn't put himself in for a commendation because he said it wasn't a thing worth commending. It was just what you did when someone needed help. Another pause. That's who you fired. I'm not telling you to feel bad about it. I'm just making sure you have the full picture. She said, I appreciate you calling. One more thing. His voice didn't change register. He's also the best operational thinker I've ever seen outside the military. If you're in logistics and you let him walk for real, that's your loss and somebody else's gain. He hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she put it down and went back to the documents, though she found she was having a little more trouble focusing than she'd had before the call. By Friday, she had what she needed. The packet she'd assembled was thorough. The unmodified security logs, the modification timestamps, the edit history, the financial disclosure showing Richard's interest in the consulting firm, the internal emails about repositioning key personnel, and a supplementary document pulling together 4 other instances over the past 18 months in which operational decisions had been influenced in ways that seemed inexplicable until you understood what Richard had to gain from them. She'd laid it all out with the kind of rigor that left no room for interpretation. She'd made 2 copies, one for the board packet and one secured off-site, because she wasn't taking any chances. She'd arranged an emergency board session for the following Tuesday. She'd told the board chair it was an urgent internal matter that required immediate attention and that she'd have a full briefing in advance. The chair, a business-like woman named Elaine Forsyth, who had been one of the main proponents of Victoria's appointment, and who consequently had a particular interest in her not failing, had agreed without asking too many questions. Victoria worked through Friday evening and into the night, refining the presentation, anticipating every possible counterargument. She'd done this before, built cases, made arguments, walked into rooms where the outcome was uncertain, and made it certain by the quality of the preparation. She was good at it. It was possibly the thing she was best at. But she'd never done it feeling quite like this. She'd never done it carrying the specific weight of knowing that the thing she was correcting was a mistake she'd made herself. That Ethan had gone home that day and told his daughter he was tired and repainted his front door orange and was managing, and that every day he was managing was a day she'd failed to stop what should have been stopped before it started. She went home at 11, changed out of her suit, made herself eat something that wasn't from a coffee cart. She sat on her couch with the television on for company and didn't watch it, and at some point her eyes landed on the arm of the couch where the jacket had been 3 nights ago. She needed to return it. That was a practical thing she could do. She picked up her phone and opened the text thread. Typed, I still have your jacket. The response came back 12 minutes later, which meant he'd probably been asleep and woken up when his phone buzzed. I know. Keep it until this is over. She read that twice. Then she put her phone on the charger and went to bed, and for the first time since Monday, she slept more or less like a person who had a plan. Saturday morning. She drove to a neighborhood she'd never been to before, 20 miles from where her own apartment building stood, and parked in front of a house that was easy to identify because its front door was genuinely, extremely orange. She hadn't told him she was coming. She almost hadn't come at all. She'd talked herself in and out of it 3 times on the drive over, arguing with herself in the way she did when she knew what she wanted to do and hadn't yet decided whether she was allowed to want it. She was getting out of her car, borrowed, a rental, because her SUV was still on the shoulder of a highway, waiting for a tow, when the front door opened and Lily came out onto the small porch, wearing paint-stained jeans and a t-shirt with a dinosaur on it, looking at Victoria with the frank, unself-conscious assessment of childhood. Are you the lady from Daddy's work? She said. Victoria stopped. Yes, I'm Victoria. Lily considered this. He mentioned you. She said it in a tone that conveyed the information without editorializing. He's in the backyard. You can go around. Thank you, Victoria said. The gate sticks, Lily said helpfully. You have to lift it up a little when you open it. She disappeared back inside, leaving the door open in a way that was either an invitation or simply the habit of a child who didn't think about doors. Victoria found the gate, lifted it slightly when she pushed, and came around to the backyard. Ethan was crouched next to what appeared to be a raised garden bed in the early stages of construction, 2x4s, a level, a bag of soil he hadn't opened yet. He was wearing a t-shirt and jeans and work boots, his hair slightly messy, a smear of dirt on his forearm. He looked up when he heard the gate. He looked at her for a moment, then he sat back on his heels and said, "You could have texted." "I could have," she agreed. He didn't ask why she hadn't. He looked at the raised bed, then back at her. "There's coffee inside." "Lily let me in." "I know. She texted me from the kitchen." He stood up, brushed dirt off his knees. "Come in then." The kitchen was small and well used, the kind of kitchen where things had been arranged for function and not aesthetics, and where that arrangement had the comfortable logic of a space someone actually lived in. Lily was at the kitchen table with paper and colored pencils, working on something with focused concentration that she did not interrupt to acknowledge Victoria's arrival, which Victoria found oddly calming. Ethan poured coffee without asking how she took it and put the mug in front of her. She took a sip and discovered it was considerably stronger than she was used to. She didn't say anything about that. He leaned against the counter with his own cup and looked at her. "You have something to tell me." "I have everything I need," she said, "for the board meeting Tuesday. It's complete. I wanted you to know before Monday." He nodded slowly. Something moved through his expression that he contained quickly. "Richard Hale." "Yes." "Financial interest in the consulting contract." "Yes." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "There's more than just the records falsification. There are other instances. This has been going on longer than what he did to you." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "How long?" "My best estimate is 2 years, possibly longer." He absorbed that, set his cup down on the counter. 2 years? "I'm sorry," she said. It came out differently than it had in the truck. Less formal, less contained, more like what it actually was. "For my part in it. For not verifying. For all of it." He looked at her, and this time he didn't quickly contain what moved through his expression, which was complicated and tired and honest in a way that was difficult to look at directly. "You were handed a false story, and you believed it without checking," he said. "That's on you. I'm not going to pretend it isn't." A pause. "But you're doing the right thing now. That matters." From the table, without looking up from her drawing, Lily said, "Is she going to get you your job back, Daddy?" Ethan glanced at his daughter. "That's not really—" "Possibly," Victoria said. Lily looked up, looked at Victoria, then looked back at her drawing with apparent satisfaction, as though a hypothesis had been confirmed. "Good," she said. "He's been pretending he's not worried, but I can tell." Ethan picked up his coffee cup and stared at the ceiling briefly. "Thank you for that, Lily." She asked. She didn't ask. She was going to. Victoria looked at the little girl and felt something happen in the region of her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. "She's not wrong," Victoria said. "I was going to." Ethan brought his gaze back down from the ceiling and looked at Victoria, and for just a moment his mouth curved, not quite a smile, something more tentative and more real than a smile. And then he looked away, out at the window toward the backyard and the raised bed he'd been building. "The board meeting is Tuesday," he said. "Tuesday," she confirmed. They stood in the kitchen for a moment, the coffee between them, Lily's pencil scratching quietly on paper, the autumn light coming through the window and landing in an imprecise way on the worn linoleum floor. Everything unsaid between them was still unsaid, and would remain so for now, because there was still too much to get through, and this was not the moment. But she drove away from the orange door 20 minutes later feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. Like the story was still going, like the next chapter might, against reasonable expectation, be better than the one before it. Like she had not, despite significant evidence to the contrary, managed to break everything that mattered. She had a board meeting to win first. Then she'd figure out the rest. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, and by 9 that morning Richard Hale had already stopped by Victoria's office twice. The first time he brought coffee, 2 cups, one for her, casual, collegial. The kind of gesture that a person makes when they want to remind you that you like each other. He sat across from her desk and talked for 12 minutes about the Memphis Hub's quarterly numbers and a staffing issue in the night shift, and asked, almost as an aside, whether she'd heard anything more about the restructuring contract timeline. She told him the contract timeline was still being reviewed. He nodded, satisfied, and left. The second time, he came alone and without coffee, and his posture was slightly different, less relaxed, the shoulders carrying a fraction more tension than usual, and he asked if there was anything he could help her prepare for the afternoon's board session. She told him she had everything she needed. He stood at her door for just a moment too long. That fraction of a second that people sometimes can't quite control when they're trying to calculate something. And then he smiled and said, "Well, you know where to find me," and left. She watched him walk down the hall through the glass partition of her office, and she thought, he knows something is wrong. He doesn't know what. But he knows. She picked up her phone and texted Diane Morales. "Make sure IT has locked the senior leadership workstations from external file access. Effective immediately." The response came back in under a minute. Done. The packet had gone to the board members the night before, sent securely, with a cover note from Victoria that said, simply, that the session would address an urgent internal matter with significant implications for the company's operational integrity, and that she appreciated their availability on short notice. She had not told them what was in the packet. She had sent it at 9 p.m., late enough that Richard, if he had any remaining contacts on the board who might have tipped him, would have had limited time to prepare a response. Elaine Forsyth, the board chair, had called at 9:40 to confirm receipt and had said, with a careful neutrality that conveyed she had read at least the first third, "This is thorough, Victoria." "It's complete," Victoria had said. "Yes." A pause. "I'll see you tomorrow." That was the whole conversation. Hotel. The board convened at 2 sharp in the 14th floor conference room, the real one, the one with the long mahogany table and the wall of windows that looked out over the city, not the mid-level rooms where operational meetings happened. 8 board members, Elaine Forsyth at the head, and Victoria standing at the front with her laptop connected to the display screen and a printed copy of the packet at every seat. Richard Hale was not in his room. He had not been invited. This was something he would not yet realize was significant. Victoria had stood in front of rooms like this before. Not this specific room, but rooms with this specific quality, the quiet authority of people who controlled large things looking at you and waiting to be persuaded. She had been nervous in those rooms, in the early days, and had learned to manage it by converting the nervous energy into focus. Today she wasn't nervous. She was something else. Purposeful, maybe, in a way that had weight to it, that came from the specific kind of clarity you only got when you knew you were doing the right thing. And the right thing was also the hard thing. She had done something wrong. She was here to fix it, and in fixing it she was going to take down a man who had spent 2 years treating this company's resources like a personal ATM and its people like obstacles to be repositioned when they got in the way. She started talking. She walked them through the attendance records first, the modification timestamps, the workstation origin, the comparison between the falsified logs and the raw security badge data. She showed them side by side. She said Ethan Mercer's name clearly and without hedging and explained what had been done to him and why she believed it had been done. She watched the board members' faces as they followed along in their packets. The particular kind of stillness that settled over people when they were reading something that made them angry but were not yet ready to show it. Then she moved to the financial conflict of interest, the consulting subcontract, the holding company, the quarterly payouts. She had a timeline that laid out the decision points at which Richard's operational recommendations had coincided within 90 days with financial benefit to his private interest. 4 instances over 2 years. The 5th, the Eastern Hub restructuring contract, the one that was still pending, would have been the largest. By the time she reached the 3rd chart, James Whitfield, the board member who'd been at Caldwell longest, a quiet, methodical man who had the reputation of being impossible to rattle, had stopped looking at his packet and was looking at her. I was going to pull 20% of the consulting fee through a subcontract to his own holding company? Whitfield said. Based on the structure I found, yes. The contract hasn't been finalized, which is why this is recoverable. But the intent is documented in the internal emails I've included on page 12. Whitfield turned to page 12. Read. Said nothing for a moment, then said, "Who else has seen this?" "My EA, the HR director, the IT director, and an outside attorney I retained for review. No one in the senior leadership tier. Richard doesn't know you're presenting this today." "No." Another silence. Elaine Forsyth, who had been watching Victoria with an expression of focused attention throughout the entire presentation, said, "What are you recommending, Victoria?" "Immediate removal, referral to the audit committee for a full forensic review of his operational decisions over the past 24 months. Notification to legal counsel regarding potential breach of fiduciary duty and fraud." She paused. "And reinstatement of Ethan Mercer with full back pay for the period of wrongful termination, plus the offer of a promotion to Director of Operations, a role that, based on his record, he's qualified for and that, frankly, would have benefited this company if we'd offered it to him 2 years ago. Elaine looked around the table. Discussion? What followed was 45 minutes of careful, surgical conversation, the kind of conversation that boards had when they were doing what they were supposed to do, which was not rubber stamping executive decisions, but actually governing. They asked questions Victoria had anticipated and a few she hadn't. They went back and forth over the legal exposure. Whitfield asked 3 specific questions about the financial documentation that required her to pull up additional files on her laptop, which she had ready. At the end of it, Elaine called the vote, 7-1 for immediate removal. The one dissent was a board member named Patterson, who had been at the company since Richard Hale's early years there, and who voted no without explanation and would not meet anyone's eyes afterward. Victoria noted that, filed it away, and moved forward. Richard Hale was in his office when security came. This was something Victoria had coordinated with Elaine Forsyth in the 3 minutes between the vote and the end of the meeting. 2 members of building security, accompanied by Diane Morales and Caldwell's general counsel, arriving at Richard's office at approximately 3:15 while the board was still formally in session upstairs. The timing mattered. The building's ID system had already been updated. His badge was deactivated at 3:13. Victoria was not there for that part. She'd deliberately chosen not to be. Not out of squeamishness, she'd made the decision, she owned it. But because there was something in the specific theater of watching a man be escorted out that she didn't need and he didn't need, and the outcome was the same either way. She was in her office with the door closed, sitting at her desk, when she heard the building's ambient sounds change slightly in the way they do when something unusual is happening on the floor. Voices that dropped to murmurs, the particular quality of people trying to look like they weren't watching something. She looked out through the glass partition. She could see at the far end of the hall the motion of several people moving. She looked for a moment and then looked away and picked up her phone. She called Ethan. He answered on the second ring. "Sterling." "It's done," she said. "The vote was 7-1. He's being escorted out right now." A pause, long enough that she was about to say something else. "Okay," he said. Just that. "Okay." The same word he'd used in the conference room when she'd told him he was fired, the same flatness, the same containment, but with a different quality underneath it now, something that had been braced against impact and found, instead, solid ground. "I want to offer you the Director of Operations position formally," she said, "in person, but I wanted to tell you the outcome first before I asked you anything." Another pause. "When?" he said. "Whenever works for you. Tomorrow. This week." "Tomorrow's fine." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear, faintly in the background, Lily's voice saying something she couldn't make out. "Victoria." "Yeah." "You did good," he said. It was simple and direct, and it cost him something. She could hear it cost him something, that slight roughness at the edge of the words that meant a person was keeping themselves together by being economical. That was the right thing. She sat at her desk in her glass-walled office and looked at nothing in particular and said, "I'll see you tomorrow." The news moved through the company the way news always did in close-quarters organizations. Fast, distorted at the edges, but accurate at the core. By the following morning, the basic facts were known to most of the staff. Richard Hale had been removed. The board had met. The new CEO had brought something forward. What most people didn't yet know, though they were speculating, because people in companies always speculated, was the Ethan Mercer part of it. Ethan came in through the lobby at 10 o'clock the next morning, wearing a jacket he'd pressed himself, carrying the coffee mug he'd packed when he left his desk 8 days ago. He hadn't been back in the building since that morning. The security guard at the lobby desk, a man named Gerald, who'd been there for years and who'd watched Ethan leave with that mug and that fox carving and hadn't said anything because there was nothing useful to say, looked up and then grinned. And, "Mr. Mercer," Gerald said. "Gerald." Ethan set his visitor badge on the desk. "I'm here to see Ms. Sterling." "I know you are." Gerald was already printing a new temporary badge. "You know, I heard what happened. Word travels. In this building it does." Gerald handed over the badge. "Good to see you back." "Let's see how the day goes," Ethan said, which was not the confirmatory statement Gerald was probably hoping for, but it was the honest one. He took the elevator to the 14th floor for the first time in his 6 years at Caldwell. The executive floor had a particular texture to it, quieter than the floors below, better carpet, the kind of ambient professionalism that was supposed to signal importance and mostly signaled expense. He found Victoria's office through the glass partitions, knocked once on the open door. She looked up from her computer. She was wearing a dark blazer, hair back, the full professional configuration, but something in her face was different than it had been in that conference room 9 days ago. More open or less defended. Not unprofessional, just less armored. "Come in," she said. "Close the door." He sat across from her desk. Same relative geometry as before, except this time he'd chosen to sit, and this time the packet in front of her was not a falsified attendance record, but an employment contract with his name on it. She slid it across the desk. He looked at it without picking it up. Director of Operations. Eastern and Western hubs combined. Full authority over coordination structure, staffing recommendations for the operational tier, and a seat at the table for the restructuring contract negotiation, which is going to be rebid from scratch, with a firm that has no connection to anyone at this company. He looked at the contract. The salary figure was at the top of the page, and it was not what he'd been making before. "This is more than the coordinator role," he said. "You should have been in a director role 2 years ago. Your performance reviews said as much if anyone had read them and acted on them." She paused. "I read them. I'm acting on them." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him think, watched him actually work through it, not perform consideration, but genuinely sit with the decision the way he sat with most things, without hurrying. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "Is this because you feel guilty?" She didn't flinch from the question. "Yes," she said. "Partly. I'm not going to tell you it isn't, because you'd know I was lying and it would be a bad start." She met his eyes. "But it's also because you're the right person for the role. Those two things can both be true." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the contract and read through it. Actually read it, all of it, which she respected, because too many people signed things they hadn't read and then were surprised by the terms. When he got to the back page, he said, "This clause about the restructuring oversight, does this give me genuine authority to flag problems, or is it decorative?" "Genuine. If you flag it, I look at it. If you escalate, it goes to the board. That's not boilerplate, it's something I added specifically." He read it again. Then he set the contract back on the desk and said, "I'll have an attorney look at it. Give me 48 hours. "Of course." He stood. She stood. They were both slightly awkward for a moment, the moment of transition between the formal and the human, when the professional scaffolding of a conversation had done its job and you were left standing in something that was less defined. He said, "How are you?" She blinked. She started the automatic response and stopped. "I'm tired, and I think I've been managing things I should have been questioning since I started here." She said it plainly, without self-pity. "I'm working on that." He nodded. "For what it's worth," he said, "you questioned it when it mattered. Later than I should have. But you did." He picked up his coffee mug from the chair beside him where he'd set it when he came in. "Lily asked me this morning if I was going back to work." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I had a meeting." A pause. "She said to tell the lady with the orange jacket that she wants her to come see the garden bed when it's finished." Victoria looked at him. There was nothing in her professional training or her considerable experience that had prepared her for the specific feeling of being invited into something by an 8-year-old through her father's careful, understated delivery of the message. "Tell her I'd like that," she said. He nodded, moved toward the door, then stopped without turning around. "Victoria." He said it to the door rather than to her, which meant he was saying it because it needed to be said, rather than because he wanted to see her face while he said it. "I know what it cost you to build that case and take it to the board. I know it would have been easier to leave it alone. I want you to know that I know that." She stood at her desk and felt that land in the particular way that honest acknowledgement does when you've been carrying something alone. "Go see your attorney," she said, because her voice had done something she didn't want to examine in front of anyone, even him. 48 hours. He left. The door clicked shut behind him. She sat back down at her desk and put her face in her hands for approximately 30 seconds, which was as long as she was willing to allow herself, and then she sat up, opened her laptop, and got back to work. 2 days later, Ethan signed the contract. He returned to work the following Monday. His old desk was gone. Director of Operations had an office, an actual office with a door and a window, on the third floor between the regional coordinators and the logistics planning team. It was not large. The window looked out over the parking structure rather than the city. Someone had left a plant on the windowsill, a small succulent that had been there long enough to suggest it belonged to the office rather than to any specific person, and which had survived whatever succession of occupants had come through on the basis of being extremely hard to kill. Marcus Webb appeared in his doorway within 20 minutes of Ethan sitting down. "Hey," Marcus said. "I was doing the thing again. The careful path through ice thing, but this time because he wasn't sure if the dynamic had changed, which was fair." "Marcus." Ethan gestured at the chair across from the desk. "Sit down." Marcus sat. "I'm not going to do anything weird about the fact that you knew what was happening and didn't say anything," Ethan said. "Not unkind, just direct." Marcus looked like he'd expected something worse. I didn't know what was happening. I just knew something was off, and you were 26 years old, and you didn't know what to do with that." Ethan looked at him evenly. "I understand. Just, if something is off as again, come to me. That's what the door's for." Marcus nodded, too many times, the way relieved people sometimes did. "Yeah, okay, I will." "Good. What's on the Eastern Hub's schedule this week?" They got to work. A check. The days that followed had a kind of careful normalcy to them, the kind that comes after disruption when people are still learning what the new shape of things is. The staff had processed Richard's departure in the way offices processed these things, in waves, with varying degrees of shock or satisfaction depending on who you were and how long you'd been there. There were people who had never trusted him and were unsurprised. There were people who'd liked him and were shaken. There was the man named Patterson on the board, whose no vote was quietly noted by everyone who heard about it, and who had submitted his resignation from the board 6 days after the meeting, citing personal reasons. Victoria worked. She reorganized the operational reporting structure. She called in 3 outside consultants. She trusted to review the contracts Richard had touched and assess the damage, which turned out to be manageable but not small. 2 vendor agreements with inflated terms that would need to be renegotiated. 1 hiring decision that was now clearly explained by factors that had nothing to do with qualifications, and the near miss of the Eastern Hub restructuring contract, which she reissued to open bidding with an independent oversight committee that included, at her specific insistence, the director of operations. She and Ethan had a working relationship that was professional and productive, and carried underneath it the thing that neither of them was currently naming, the way you sometimes carry a thing for a long time before you figure out what to call it. They met twice a week in her office to review the restructuring timeline. Their conversations were direct and efficient, and occasionally they were not. Occasionally they got into something that was more argument than review, because they didn't always agree, and neither of them was the kind of person to pretend agreement they didn't feel. "The Memphis staffing model you're proposing," she said, in the 3rd week, looking at the spreadsheet he'd put in front of her. "You want to add 2 senior coordinators. The hub is running on 4 people doing 6 people's work," he said. "I've watched it for 3 years. We lose the Memphis contract in 18 months if we don't fix the staffing. The board is watching the operational budget closely. Adding 2 senior salaries will cost less than losing the Memphis contract." He said it flatly, not aggressively. "I can show you the numbers." She looked at the spreadsheet. "Show me." He showed her. She looked at it for a long time, and she could feel him not filling the silence with additional argument, just sitting with it, which was something she noticed about him. He made his case, and then he let it sit. He didn't pile on. He trusted the work to carry itself. "Okay," she said. "I'll take it to the budget committee." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Patterson's seat on the board isn't filled yet, and the replacement is still TBD. She looked up from the spreadsheet. "Your former CO called me." He didn't look surprised exactly, but he went slightly still. "Heller. He spoke highly of you." "He speaks highly of very few people." A pause. "What did he say?" "He told me about 2009. She watched him carefully. "The vehicle fire." A different quality of stillness now. Not discomfort exactly, but the stillness of someone encountering a thing they'd thought was private. "That's not a story I share." He said you didn't put yourself in for a commendation. It wasn't a thing worth commending. He said it the same way Heller had quoted him, which meant it was what he actually believed, not a performance of modesty. There were people in the vehicle. You get them out. She looked at him. There were, she thought, people in the world who performed goodness and people who simply were it, in the way that some people simply were tall or simply were funny, not because they were trying to be, but because it was how they were organized inside. She had met people of both kinds. She was increasingly certain which kind she was sitting across from. I wanted you to know I'd spoken to him, she said. It doesn't change anything about the contract, he said. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She looked back at the spreadsheet. Send me the full Memphis projections. I want the 3-year model. He nodded, closed his folder, stood to leave. How's the garden bed, she said. He paused at the door, looked back. And this time the thing that moved through his expression wasn't contained, not entirely. It was something wry and warm and slightly surprised, like he'd looked up and found something where he hadn't expected to. Planted, he said. Lily put in lettuce. I put in tomatoes. I think the lettuce is going to eat the tomatoes, based on current growth rate. I'll come see it, she said, when you're ready. He considered that for a moment, that specific additional layer of meaning she'd left in it. The when you're ready, that was about more than a garden bed. He didn't pretend not to understand it. He also didn't rush to respond to it. I'll let you know, he said. He left. She sat at her desk for a moment with the Memphis projections open on her screen and the memory of his face in the doorway, that slight warmth, that guarded openness. And she thought about the chain of events that had led from a school parking lot in the rain to this specific office, this specific Tuesday afternoon, this specific feeling of being at the start of something rather than in the aftermath of something. She thought about what Lily had said in the kitchen that morning, matter of fact over her colored pencils. He's been pretending he's not worried, but I can tell. Kids, she thought, had the most accurate instruments. She went back to work. That evening, Ethan picked Lily up from school, and on the drive home, Lily said, Is everything better now? At work? Yeah, getting there. And with the lady? He glanced in the rearview mirror. Lily was looking out the window with an expression of studied casualness that she had absolutely not learned from him and must have invented herself. The lady has a name, he said. Victoria. Is everything better with Victoria? He drove for a minute. The evening light was doing something particular with the trees along the road, that late autumn angle that made everything look like it was being painted rather than lit. It's getting there too, he said. Lily nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to looking out the window. Then, she's coming to see the garden, right? When it's ready. I'm going to plant flowers next, in the spring. She said it with the finality of a decision already made. Sunflowers. So there's something for her to see that's actually nice looking. He looked in the rearview mirror again. His daughter was 8 years old, and she had the exact color of eyes that Claire had. And she was, in her own way, telling him something he hadn't quite been ready to hear yet. Yeah, he said quietly. Sunflowers sound good. The road curved and the light fell differently, and the evening moved on, the way evenings do, toward whatever came next. Winter came to the city the way it usually did. Not all at once, but in increments, a few degrees at a time, the trees going bare over the course of 2 weeks, until one morning you looked out and realized they'd been empty for a while and you just hadn't marked the exact moment it happened. Ethan marked time differently now. The director role had a different rhythm than coordination, more strategic, less immediate, more time spent in rooms talking about things that wouldn't happen for 6 months, rather than solving problems that were happening right now. He was adjusting to it. Some days the adjustment felt natural, and some days he missed the clean satisfaction of a logistics problem that had a specific solution in a specific timeline, and you either hit it or you didn't. He'd told Victoria this in one of their Tuesday meetings in early November, when she'd asked how the transition was going, and he'd given her the honest answer instead of the functional one. She'd listened without interrupting, which was something he'd noticed about her. She didn't fill silence the way some people did, didn't rush to reassure or redirect. She sat with what you said and let it mean what it meant. The strategic work will feel more natural in 6 months, she'd said when he was done. That's not a prediction, it's just what happens. The adjustment period for operational thinkers moving into director roles is usually about that long. Operational thinkers, he'd said. People who are good at solving actual problems, as opposed to people who are good at talking about solving problems. He'd looked at her. Which type are you? She'd considered that for a moment, genuinely, not performing the consideration. Somewhere in the middle, she'd said. I can do both. I'm better at one than I think I am, and worse at the other than I tell myself. Which is which? I'll let you figure that out. I was still figuring it out, partly because she was not a simple person to figure out, and partly because he found, increasingly, that he wanted to. The thing between them built the way things built when two people were being careful, slowly, with long pauses, in the particular oblique way that people approach something they wanted but weren't sure they were allowed to want. Their professional relationship gave them a structure to operate within and occasionally to hide behind. And they both knew they were doing that, and neither of them called it out directly, because calling it out directly would have required one of them to say something that the other one could then respond to, and they were not quite there yet. What they were doing instead was this: Tuesday meetings that ran 20 minutes longer than they needed to. Coffee brought without asking because she'd learned how he took it, and he'd learned the same about her. A text on a random Wednesday evening from her about a Memphis contract issue, which was the professional justification, though the actual content of the text evolved over 40 minutes into something that had nothing to do with Memphis. A Saturday afternoon in early November when he'd mentioned, in passing, that Lily had an art show at the school community center, and she'd shown up, not announced, just arrived, standing in the back of the room, in a coat that was wrong for the weather because she'd clearly come straight from somewhere else and hadn't planned to stay long, and then stayed for the whole thing. Lily's art show consisted of 15 children's paintings displayed on a clothesline strung across a community room that smelled like paste and old carpet, and it was objectively not the most sophisticated cultural event Victoria Sterling had ever attended. She'd stood next to Ethan while Lily explained each painting with the focused intensity of a person presenting a doctoral thesis, and Victoria had asked the right questions, not condescending, not performing interest, but actually looking at the paintings and responding to what was in them. And Lily had noticed the difference immediately. Kids always noticed. They were better at detecting genuine attention than most adults. The three of them had gone for burgers at a place near the school that had checkered tablecloths and a jukebox that still worked, and Lily had eaten approximately one full burger and talked continuously for 40 minutes about her plans for the spring garden, the sunflowers, and also a project she was doing about insects for school, and also a new development with Professor Buttons the hamster, which apparently involved Professor Buttons having escaped his cage twice in the past week. Victoria had listened to all of it. She'd asked, at one point, whether hamsters could be trained, which had launched Lily into a detailed explanation of hamster psychology that she seemed to have researched thoroughly, and which was completely and endearingly wrong in several ways that Victoria had gently not corrected. On the drive home, Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat again. The same jacket tucked around her, the same complete and total unconsciousness. And Ethan and Victoria had sat in the front of his truck in the parking lot outside her building for 20 minutes after he'd pulled up, talking about nothing important. Both of them aware that the conversation was not really about what it was ostensibly about, and neither of them quite ready to acknowledge that. When she finally got out, he said, "Thank you for coming to the show." She said, "Thank you for mentioning it." She meant, "Thank you for leaving the door open." He said, "She's going to want you at the spring one too." He meant, "I'm going to want you there too." She said, "I'll be there." She meant all of it. She went inside and he drove home, and neither of them said the actual thing. But the actual thing had been said anyway, in that imprecise and deniable way that people use when they are being careful with something they don't want to break. November became December, and December was complicated by the restructuring contract negotiation, which was real work, demanding and occasionally contentious, and which put Ethan and Victoria on the same side of a table facing external consultants who had not previously encountered a CEO and a director of operations who were quite so aligned on priorities. The lead consultant from the bidding firm, a man named Garrett, who had the particular brand of confidence that came from having been in a room telling people what to do for so long that he'd forgotten other people were allowed to have opinions, made the mistake, in the second negotiation session, of directing all his responses to Victoria and visibly discounting Ethan's objections to the proposed staffing model. Ethan had objected, clearly and specifically, to a clause that restructured the Eastern Hub's overnight coordination under a subcontracted team rather than Caldwell's own staff. He'd laid out the operational risk in 4 sentences, which was about 3 sentences more than it needed. Garrett had smiled the smile of a man managing an inconvenience and said, I understand the concern, but this is fairly standard in restructuring models of this scale. Victoria, the cost analysis on page 7 addresses most of. He raised a specific operational objection, Victoria said. She said it without heat, just as a fact. Address it. Garrett looked at her, then at Ethan, then back at her. The subcontracted team has. He said the overnight coordination risk wasn't addressed in the staffing model, Ethan said. That's not a cost question. Answer the operational question. Garrett answered the operational question. Not well, as it turned out, because the answer revealed that the staffing model hadn't actually accounted for the overnight coordination handoff in the way Ethan had identified, and by the end of the session they'd agreed to revise that clause in a way that cost the consulting firm a meaningful portion of their proposed implementation fee. In the elevator after, walking down to the parking structure, Victoria said, That was a good catch. It wasn't a catch, he said. It was in the model the whole time. Someone just didn't read it. Garrett didn't read it. Garrett's firm put it together. It's the same thing. She looked at him sideways. You enjoyed that? He considered. A little, he said, which was probably the most he'd admit to enjoying anything. She laughed, an actual laugh, unguarded, the kind that happened when something was genuinely funny rather than politely funny. It caught him slightly off guard, and he looked at her sideways in return. What? She said. Nothing. He looked forward again. You should do that more. Do what? Not manage your reactions. She was quiet for a moment. The elevator reached the parking level and opened. They walked out into the dim concrete space with its particular cold and its echoes. I don't, she started. You do, he said, not unkindly. Most of the time you decide what to show before you show it. It's a good skill. It's also slightly exhausting to be around. She stopped walking. He stopped too, because she'd stopped. She looked at him. He looked back. This was one of those moments, she'd had a few of them with him by now, where he said something true that no one else in her life had said, and she could either deflect it or she could sit with it. My mother told me when I was 12 that I was too much, she said. Too loud, too opinionated, too much. She said it flatly, the way you said things that had been sitting in you long enough to lose their sting on the outside while keeping all of it on the inside. I learned to calibrate. He was quiet for a moment. You're not too much, he said. You're enough. You just show it in installments. She stood in the parking structure and felt something she hadn't quite felt before in his presence. Not warmth exactly, though that was part of it, but the specific sensation of being seen accurately, which was different from being seen kindly and different from being seen clearly, and was somehow more than both of those things combined. Ethan, she said. Yeah. I'm going to say something. Okay. I don't know how to do this. She gestured slightly between the two of them. I'm not good at this part. The personal part. I can run a company. I can build a fraud case. I can negotiate a contract in 3 languages. I'm not good at. She stopped. I'm telling you so you know, before this goes further, however far this goes. He looked at her for a long moment. His expression did the thing it occasionally did. The controlled surface and the warmth beneath it that came through anyway, if you were paying attention. I'm not either, he said. I've been doing everything myself for 5 years. I don't ask for help. I don't let people in easily. I tell myself it's for Lily's sake, that I don't want to disrupt her life, but most of it is just. He paused, searching for the honest word. Fear. Old fear, dressed up as practicality. She said nothing, let it land. So we're both bad at it, he said. Yes. Okay. He said it the way he said most things, with a quiet finality that was not indifference but acceptance. Then we'll both be bad at it together and figure it out as we go. She looked at him. That's your plan? That's my plan. She considered this. It was not, by any objective measure, the most sophisticated emotional declaration she'd ever been offered. It also felt more honest than any of the sophisticated ones. Okay, she said. They stood in the parking structure for another moment, and then she said, I should go. And he said, yeah. And she walked to her car and he walked to his truck, and nothing dramatic happened, which was exactly right, because what had just happened between them was not the kind of thing that needed drama. It was the kind of thing that needed time. Christmas came and went. Ethan's sister Dana visited from Portland for a week with her husband and their 2 kids. And the house was loud in a way it usually wasn't. Kids everywhere, cooking smells, someone always in the bathroom when you needed it. Dana had met Victoria once, at a coffee that Ethan had arranged with a casualness that didn't fool his sister for 1 second. "She's not what I expected," Dana told him, in the kitchen on the last night of her visit, while their respective children were in the living room doing something that involved a significant amount of shouting. "What did you expect?" he said. "Someone colder, based on what happened." "She's not cold." "No," Dana agreed. She was quiet for a moment, washing dishes with the focused energy of someone who was thinking about something else. "She looks at you like she's still figuring you out." "She is still figuring me out." "So are you, with her." Dana handed him a wet plate to dry. "That's not a bad thing. It means you're both paying attention." He dried the plate without answering, which was its own answer. "Lily likes her," Dana said. "Lily likes almost everyone. Lily is selective as hell, and you know it." Dana handed him another plate. "She didn't like that guy from your unit who came for Thanksgiving 3 years ago." "Nobody liked him. He ate all the rolls before dinner." "She likes Victoria," Dana said again, as if he'd been arguing the point, which he hadn't. "That matters. You know it matters." He put the dried plate in the cabinet. "I know." "So what are you waiting for?" He thought about the parking structure, the conversation, what they'd said to each other, what he hadn't said yet. What he suspected she hadn't said yet either, because they'd agreed, without agreeing to anything explicitly, to go slowly, not out of ambivalence, but out of a mutual understanding that whatever this was, it was the kind of thing you didn't rush, the kind of thing that built from something real, or it didn't build at all. "I'm not waiting," he said. "I'm being careful." Dana looked at him with the expression of an older sister who had been watching her younger brother navigate his own life with careful intelligence and occasional complete obtuseness for his entire life. "There's a difference," she said. "Sometimes." "I know," he said. She didn't say anything else about it. She knew when she'd made her point. January was cold and brutal and consumed almost entirely by work. The restructuring contract was finalized in the 3rd week, a 14-page agreement that Ethan had reviewed line by line and Victoria had fought for in budget sessions that ran past 6 in the evening 3 nights in a row. When they signed, it was a Tuesday afternoon, and afterward Ethan went back to his office and stood at the window looking at the parking structure and felt, for the first time since the contract process started, like he could breathe at a normal depth. Victoria texted him 20 minutes after the signing. "Memphis gets their 2 coordinators. Budget approved." He texted back. "I know. I was in the room. I wanted to tell you directly." He looked at that for a moment, then, "Thank you. You did the work. Thank yourself." He put his phone down and went back to the projections he was building for Q2. Marcus knocked on his door at 4 to ask about the hub staffing calendar, and they worked through it for 40 minutes. And when Marcus left, Ethan realized it was the first time in months that he'd gotten through an entire afternoon without the low-grade background frequency of worry that had run underneath everything since those days at home between being fired and being reinstated. He was here. He'd built something. He'd taken the job that was offered and done it in the way he did everything. Not brilliantly, not showily, but completely, with full attention and full commitment. And it had mattered. He called Lily from the parking lot on his way to the car. "How was your day?" she said, immediately and without preamble, which was how she always answered his calls. "Good," he said. "Actually good. How was yours?" "Maya and I had a fight." "About?" "She said hamsters are boring pets, and I said that was a deeply ignorant thing to say. She's not wrong that they're not the most interactive pets." "Daddy, but you're also not wrong that it was ignorant." He unlocked his truck. "Did you work it out?" "We agreed to disagree." A pause. "Which means she thinks she won." "Did she?" "Of course not." The confidence was complete and unaffected. "Are you coming straight home?" "Yeah, you want anything specific for dinner?" "Could we have pasta?" "We could have pasta." He got in, started the engine. "Lily." "Yeah?" "Good day," he said again. Just that. She knew what he meant. "Good," she said. "I'm glad." Basim. February came in cold and went out colder. Victoria's birthday was the 14th. He found this out from Priya, not from Victoria, because Victoria was not someone who announced personal information readily. And he thought about what to do with that information for approximately a week before deciding to do the most straightforward thing, which was bring coffee to her office on the morning of and set it on her desk and say, "Happy birthday." She looked up from her laptop, looked at the coffee, looked at him. "Who told you?" "Priya." "I'm going to speak to Priya." "Don't." I asked her. She was being helpful. He sat across from her desk. "Any plans?" "No." She said it without self-pity, which was how she said most things. "My mother called this morning. We talked for 7 minutes." He looked at her. 7 minutes? "We run out of things to say." She picked up the coffee. "It's fine. We've always been like that." He thought about what she'd said in the parking structure. "My mother told me when I was 12 that I was too much." He thought about the very specific damage that a specific kind of parent could do to a person, and how that damage went quiet and underground and then showed up in the way you managed your reactions, the way you rationed what you let people see. "Come for dinner," he said. She looked at him. "Just dinner," he said. "Lily's making pasta. She's been making it every week since February started because she's decided she's Italian now." Victoria's mouth moved. "She's decided she's Italian." "Don't ask. It involves a documentary she watched about Rome." He looked at her steadily. "Come for dinner, birthday dinner. Lily will be very proud of the pasta, and you won't have to talk to anyone about work." She sat with it for a moment. He could see her doing the thing, calibrating, deciding what to show. And then he saw her make a different choice, the one that didn't hide. "What time?" she said. 7. "I'll bring wine." "Lily will want juice." "I'll bring both." She came at 7 with wine and a juice box. Actually a juice box, the kind with the little straw, which she presented to Lily with such perfect gravity that Lily received it with equal gravity and immediately incorporated it into the dinner table setting as if it were fine crystal. The pasta was good, not perfectly al dente, a little too much salt, which Ethan noticed and didn't mention, and Lily had already moved on from anyway, because she was explaining the architectural genius of the Colosseum to Victoria, who was listening with the expression of a person who was genuinely learning things. After dinner, Lily helped clear the table. She'd recently decided clearing the table was beneath her in some vague 9-year-old way, but for some reason she cleared it tonight without being asked. And then she said, with studied casualness, "I'm going to do my homework," and disappeared to her room, which was not subtle, but was so transparently well-intentioned that neither adult could do anything but exchange a look. The look lasted a half-second longer than looks usually did. "She's not doing homework," Victoria said. "She finished her homework at 4, Ethan confirmed. "She's giving us space." "Yes." "She's 8. 8.5, he said. "She'd want me to be precise." Victoria turned her wine glass in her hands. Outside, the winter had settled into the quiet it got after 10. No wind, just cold, the kind of still that made interior spaces feel more interior. The kitchen light was warm and slightly yellow. The good kind of kitchen light that forgave everything and made people look like the best version of themselves. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "I was wrong about something." He waited. "I told you in the parking structure that I wasn't good at the personal part." She was looking at the table, then looked up. "That's true. But I think I've been using it as a reason to go slowly, when actually I'm just scared." He said nothing. Let her finish. "I'm scared that that what my mother said will be true. That I'll be too much or not enough, or that I'll be better at the idea of this than the reality of it." She paused. "I've done that before. Been better at the idea of something than the actual daily work of it." "Everyone's done that," he said. "I know. I'm just telling you, so you know what you're working with." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about what it cost her to say that. A woman who ran a company, who'd built a fraud case from raw data and taken it to a board and won, who managed her expressions before she showed them and had been doing it since she was 12 years old. He thought about what it took to set that down and say, simply, "I'm scared." "Claire died when Lily was 3, he said. She went very still. I haven't talked about her much. With anyone." He turned his coffee mug in his hands, the same way she'd been turning her wine glass. She was practical. She didn't make things complicated. She just figured out what needed to be done and did it. He paused. "After she died, I think I decided that if I didn't let anyone close, I couldn't lose anything else. And then I told myself it was for Lily, because that's a cleaner story. But it wasn't only for Lily. He looked up. She was watching him with that quality of absolute attention she had, the kind that made you feel like what you were saying was the only thing in the room. I'm telling you because you told me, he said. So you know what you're working with, too. She said, she sounds like she was good. She was, he said. She was. A silence. Not empty, not uncomfortable. The kind that came after something true. Then Lily's voice from down the hall, perfectly pitched to Carrie, "Is everything okay out there?" Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Yes, Lily. Just checking." A pause. "I found a really interesting fact about the Roman aqueducts if anyone wants to hear it." Victoria pressed her lips together, suppressing something. "Sure," Ethan said, in the patient tone of a man who had been parenting alone for 5 years and had developed a capacity for patience that was more genuine than most. "Come tell us." Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, holding a library book about ancient Rome, her hair coming out of a braid in all directions, completely and utterly herself. She sat down at the table between them and opened the book to a page she'd marked with a sticky note shaped like a star. "Okay," she said, "so the Romans moved water uphill, which should be impossible." "Should be," Victoria agreed, "but they figured it out." Lily pointed at the diagram. "Because they were really stubborn." Ethan looked at his daughter. He looked at Victoria, who was looking at the diagram with genuine attention, her chin resting in one hand, the carefully managed distance she normally carried completely absent. He thought, stubborn people figure it out. He thought that was probably true about most things worth figuring out. He got up and poured himself more coffee, and the evening settled into something warm and ordinary and specific to this kitchen, this table, these 3 people, imperfect and cautious and moving toward each other anyway. The way you moved toward things you actually wanted, not in a rush, but without stopping. Spring arrived without announcement, the way it always did. Not on the calendar date, but on some random Tuesday, when you walked outside and the air was different, warmer and carrying something green in it, and you realized that winter had stopped while you weren't paying attention. Lily noticed first. She noticed most things first. She came into the kitchen on a Saturday morning in late March with her boots already on and a trowel in her hand and announced that it was time to plant the sunflowers, and that this was not a suggestion, and that she had already looked up the optimal soil depth for sunflower seeds in their region and written it on a piece of paper that she was now placing on the kitchen table in front of Ethan's coffee cup. He looked at the paper. She had drawn a small sun in the corner, which was either decorative or instructional. He wasn't sure. "Victoria's coming at 11, she said. He looked up. "I didn't know that." "I texted her." He set down his coffee cup. "Lily, you can't just—" She said yes. Lily's expression was the particular combination of innocence and complete absence of apology that she'd been deploying since approximately age 4. "She's bringing soil amendment. I told her what kind." Ethan looked at his daughter. He thought about saying something about boundaries, about not making decisions for other people, about the fact that he was the adult in this household. He thought about all of that, and then he picked up his coffee and said, "How do you know what soil amendment is?" "I looked it up." She picked up the paper with the planting instructions and tucked it into her jacket pocket. "Also, she wants to come. She said she'd been waiting for the garden to be ready." He looked at the table. Outside, the morning light was coming through the kitchen window at the angle it got in spring, different from winter light, more direct, more willing. The garden bed was there in the backyard, visible through the glass, the soil from the previous fall still dark and waiting. He thought about what Victoria had said in December, in the parking structure. "I'll let you know when it's ready." He'd said that, and what she'd said, "I'd like that." It had been 4 months. He supposed that was ready. "Fine," he said. Lily was already heading for the back door. What? She arrived at 11:10 in jeans and a jacket that was not the one she'd taken from his truck in the storm. That one was still in his hallway closet, where it had quietly taken up residence sometime around December, and where neither of them had suggested it should leave. And she was carrying a bag with the soil amendment, and also, because she was Victoria, a copy of the morning paper and coffee in a thermos, because she'd thought the drive would take longer than it did. She handed him the thermos. He took it without commenting on the fact that she'd brought it, which was how they'd gotten good at things. Not remarking on the gestures, just accepting them, because the gesture was the thing, and remarking on it would have turned it into something smaller. Lily materialized from the backyard, trowel in hand, and said, "You got the right amendment." "You gave me very specific instructions," Victoria said. "People don't always follow specific instructions." "I usually do." She looked at Lily with the level seriousness that Lily had decided, sometime in the past few months, was the appropriate way to be addressed. "Are we doing the whole bed or just the south side?" Lily considered her. "You've been reading about sunflowers." "A little. The south side gets better light." Lily turned and walked back toward the garden. "Come on." They spent 2 hours in the backyard, the three of them. It was not elegant work. The soil from the previous fall had compacted through winter and needed breaking up, and Lily's understanding of optimal seed depth turned out to be slightly more theoretical than practical. And at one point, Victoria knelt in the dirt to correct the angle of a planting hole and stayed there for 20 minutes because Lily kept asking questions, and she kept answering them. Ethan worked the other end of the bed, mixing in the amendment, and he let them talk, listening to his daughter explain to a CEO the precise science of why sunflowers track the sun, and watching that CEO listen with full and unperformed attention. He had a thought, standing there with dirt on his hands, that he didn't say out loud, that Claire would have liked her. He hadn't been able to think that about anyone in 5 years without it feeling wrong. Today, it felt like the truth, stated plainly, without a verdict attached. Claire would have liked her. The world had moved forward. Both things were true, and neither one canceled the other. He worked that soil until the thought settled in him fully and became quiet. At some point, Lily went inside. She claimed to need water, but the real reason was the same reason she'd done her homework at 4 on Valentine's Day. And Ethan and Victoria were left alone in the garden in the spring afternoon. She was brushing soil off her hands. He was tamping down the last row of seeds. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and the quiet was the specific kind of quiet that had developed between them over these months. Not silence in the absence of things to say, but quiet in the presence of something that didn't need words right away. She said, "I've been offered another position." He stopped tamping. "From outside the company," she said. She was still looking at her hands, brushing dirt off her palms. "A private equity group. They want someone to turn around a mid-sized freight company in Boston. It's a significant offer." He looked at her. "When did this come in?" 3 weeks ago." She looked up. "I've been trying to figure out what to do with it." He sat back on his heels. 3 weeks ago. "I didn't know how to bring it up." He was quiet, doing what he did, sitting with it, not rushing the thought. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know." She said it honestly, which cost her something. He could see it cost her. "Part of me. The part that's been running toward the next thing for as long as I can remember. That part says take it. It's a bigger role, more autonomy. Boston is..." She paused. "Boston is far enough to be a clean start." "From what?" She looked at him directly. "That's the question I keep getting stuck on." He stood up, brushed the dirt off his own hands, looked at the row of seeds they'd put in, small, invisible under the soil, the complete opposite of what they'd eventually become. "Do you want to go?" he said. Not an accusation, a real question. She was quiet for a long moment. A bird was doing something enthusiastic in the maple tree at the edge of the yard. The afternoon had gotten warmer in the way spring afternoons did, incrementally, and the light was doing something generous across the whole yard. "No," she said. And I don't entirely trust that answer because I've talked myself into staying in the wrong places before because I was afraid to move. So I don't know if I'm staying because I want to stay or staying because I'm afraid. "What's here," he said carefully, "that wasn't in the wrong places before?" She looked at him for a moment that was long enough to mean something. "You know what's here," she said. He did know. He said, "I'm not going to tell you to stay. I want to be clear about that." "I know." She said it without reproach. "I'm not asking you to." "But I want you to know," he said, and his voice had the quality it sometimes had, the flat surface and the real thing underneath it, that whatever you're trying to figure out here, whatever this is, it's real. For me, it's real. I haven't said that directly. I'm saying it now so you have it as information, to do whatever you want with it. The bird in the maple tree kept at it. Somewhere inside the house, Lily was almost certainly pressed against the kitchen window, watching. Victoria looked at him, and she did the thing that she'd been learning to do since December. She didn't calibrate first, didn't decide what to show before she showed it. She let him see the whole thing, the uncertainty and the wanting and the fear and the specific joy of being in this backyard on this afternoon with these people, all of it simultaneously, none of it managed. "I'm staying," she said. "Not for you specifically, for the whole of it, for the job I built, and the case I won, and the team I'm not done with." She paused. "And yes, for you, and for Lily, for all of it." He nodded. He didn't immediately say anything because he was the kind of person who let things land before he responded to them. Then he said, Okay, she said. "You should call them back." "I will. Today, if possible. Those things get more complicated the longer." "Ethan," she almost laughed. "I know." "Right." He looked at the garden bed. "You have dirt on your face." She touched her cheek, found it, rubbed at it ineffectively with the back of her hand and made it slightly worse. He reached over and, with the corner of his sleeve, cleared it. It took approximately 2 seconds. She went very still while he did it, and then he stepped back. And they stood there in the afternoon with the seeds in the ground, and the maple tree's first pale green buds overhead, and everything said that needed to be said, for now. The back door opened, and Lily appeared. She looked at the two of them. She looked at the garden bed. She looked at Ethan's sleeve, which now had a small smudge of dirt on it. "Did you plant all the rows?" she said. "All of them," Victoria confirmed. "Good." Lily came down the steps. She walked up to the garden bed and crouched down and looked at the surface of the soil with the gravity of a person inspecting their work. And then she stood up and said, to no one in particular, "They're going to be really tall." "They will," Ethan said. Lily looked at him, looked at Victoria, looked back at the garden. "I'm making lunch," she announced. "I'm going to try a frittata. I watched a video." "A frittata?" Victoria said. "It's Italian." She said it with full confidence. "I know what I'm doing." She went inside. The screen door bounced twice behind her. Ethan and Victoria stood in the spring afternoon looking at the garden bed. And after a moment, Victoria said, "What are the odds on the frittata?" "Honestly," he considered, 60-40. "In favor?" 60 against. He picked up the trowel. "But she'll be proud of it either way." "Then I'll eat it either way." They went inside. The frittata was, in fact, slightly overcooked on one side and undercooked on the other, and aggressively seasoned, and Lily served it with the confidence of someone presenting a flawless dish, and both Ethan and Victoria ate it with complete sincerity and told her it was good, which was not entirely a lie because the flavor was actually fine. And the three of them sat at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light, and it was ordinary and imperfect, and specifically, unmistakably, theirs. 3 months later, the board formally cleared Victoria's position following the completion of the forensic audit that had been running since January. The audit confirmed what she'd suspected, and worse, Richard Hale had been quietly routing operational decisions toward his private interests for closer to 3 years than 2, and the total financial exposure was significant enough that Caldwell's legal team had referred the matter to the state attorney's office. Richard's response, through his lawyers, was to deny everything with the specific vigor of someone who had convinced himself, over years of small compromises, that what he'd done wasn't really what he'd done. Victoria read the denial statement once and didn't read it again. She had enough to deal with without spending mental energy on a man who had spent his last professional breath trying to rewrite history. The board, in a session in late June, gave Victoria a formal vote of confidence, not the hedged, conditional kind that boards sometimes issued when they were managing optics, but the direct kind, the kind where the vote was unanimous, and Elaine Forsyth said, in her closing remarks, that the past 8 months had demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and integrity that the board had hoped for when they made their appointment. Victoria sat in the boardroom after everyone had left, and she allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of sitting there with what that felt like. And then she picked up her phone and called Ethan. "The audit is final," she said when he answered. "Full confirmation. It's going to the attorney's office." "I heard." She could hear he was in his truck, road noise, the particular acoustic of his cab. "How do you feel?" She thought about that. "Like I want to go home," she said. "Is that strange?" I thought I'd want to celebrate or something. I just want to go home. A pause. Come here then. He said it simply. You're driving. I'm almost there. Lily's art show is tonight, remember? She'd remembered. She'd had it in her calendar for 3 weeks. I haven't missed one yet. No, he said. You haven't. She drove to the community center through the June evening, the city doing what it did in early summer. Slower, looser, people on sidewalks and in doorways, the light still going strong at 7:30. She found a parking spot and walked in, and Lily found her before she found Ethan, coming at her from across the community room with paint in her hair and a program clutched in one hand. You're here, Lily said, the way she always said it. Not surprised, but satisfied, like a prediction confirmed. I'm here. Victoria crouched down. Is my painting in the show? They'd done a painting project 3 weeks earlier, the two of them at Lily's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. Lily teaching, Victoria learning, with results that Lily had diplomatically described as expressive. Victoria's painting was of the garden, more or less, if you looked at it with generosity. Lily's face did something complicated. I put it up, she said. At the back. The back. The light's better in the back. That's very diplomatic. Your colors are good, Lily said, also diplomatically. The shapes are... She searched for a word. Terrible, Victoria offered. Abstract, Lily said firmly. Victoria laughed and stood up and let Lily pull her by the hand toward the clothesline of paintings. She found hers, yes, at the back. Yes, the shapes were not good, but the colors were. She'd meant what she said about that. And next to it was Lily's painting, which was, objectively, remarkable for a 9-year-old. It was the maple tree, the one in the backyard. Painted in that specific late afternoon light with the first green buds of spring, 3 figures barely suggested at the base of the trunk, small enough to be symbolic rather than literal, but present. Victoria stood in front of it for a long moment. Ethan appeared at her shoulder. She heard him before she saw him, the specific sound of his presence, unhurried, solid. He looked at the painting. She finished it last week, he said. She wouldn't tell me what it was until she was done. It's the backyard, Victoria said. Yeah. In spring, when we planted. Yeah. She looked at the 3 small figures at the base of the tree. She thought about what it meant that a 9-year-old had seen that afternoon as a thing worth painting, as a thing worth commemorating, and she thought about all the ordinary afternoons that accumulated into a life, and how you couldn't always identify the important ones while they were happening. You just had to show up and pay attention and trust that the important ones were in there. She said quietly, so only he could hear. She put us in it. She did, he said. All 3 of us. All 3 of us. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. Lily reappeared from somewhere with a cup of juice and a program she wanted them to look at, and the evening continued the way evenings continued, full of small things that were not small. The sunflowers came up in July. Lily had been checking them with religious devotion since May. Every morning, before school, a quick trip to the garden bed, reporting back to whoever was in the kitchen with updates that ranged from still nothing to something is happening to, I can see 2 of them for real now. Ethan had put in tomatoes again, and peppers this time, and whatever the opposite of agricultural talent was, he appeared to have it, because the tomatoes were already looking skeptical, and the peppers had staged what appeared to be a philosophical objection to existence. The sunflowers, Lily's sunflowers, were not skeptical. They came up straight and fast, and by mid-July 3 of them were taller than Lily, and one of them was taller than Victoria, who went to see them on a Saturday in the 3rd week of July, and stood next to it for measurement while Lily took a photograph with Ethan's phone. It's taller, Lily confirmed. Marginally, Victoria said. Significantly. Lily showed her the photo. See? Your head doesn't even clear the... I see it, thank you. Ethan was in the kitchen making dinner, and the window was open, and through it came the smell of something actually cooking well for once. He'd gotten better over the months, or he'd stopped being distracted by everything else, and started paying attention to what was in front of him, which was probably the same thing. Victoria had noticed it about him, this quality of redirection. He'd been so focused on managing the loss, on holding everything together through the sheer force of showing up every day, that he'd almost forgotten to participate in the things he was showing up for. I was participating now. She came inside while Lily stayed with the sunflowers, doing what she did, talking to them, measuring them, writing things down in the notebook she'd designated specifically for garden observations, which was the most Lily thing that had ever existed. Victoria went to the kitchen, stood at the counter. "She's taller than your sunflowers," she said. "The sunflowers will catch up." "One of them already is." He stirred something, checked something else. The kitchen smelled like garlic and rosemary, and the particular warmth of someone cooking in a house that had people in it. "Ethan." "Hmm?" "I've been thinking about something." He looked up from the stove. Read her face, which she let him read. "Okay," he said. He turned the heat down on whatever he was cooking and turned around, leaning against the counter, giving her his full attention the way he always did when something mattered. "This past year," she said, "since that conference room." "Since that conference room," he said, "I've been—" She paused, choosing the words carefully because she wanted them to be right, not managed, just right. "I've spent most of my adult life treating my life like a project, like something to optimize. Next role, next challenge, next thing to prove." She looked at him steadily. "And then you sat down across from me in that room and I fired you for the wrong reasons, and you walked out with your coffee mug and your daughter's painting, and you had more dignity in that moment than I've managed in most of my career." He didn't say anything. His expression was the open one, the one that had taken a long time to find its way there. "I'm not the same person I was a year ago," she said. "I don't think that's dramatic. I think it's just true. And I need to say it out loud to you because you're most of the reason it's true." A silence. From the backyard, they could both hear Lily, now apparently lecturing the sunflowers about something, her voice carrying through the open window with its usual total commitment. "You're not most of the reason," he said. "You built the case. You sat in front of that board. You did the work." He paused. "I was just—" He searched for the right word. "The reason you had to." "Yes," she said, "and that's what I mean." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not the same either." He said it simply. "I'd gotten good at the idea that being okay was enough, that getting through every day and keeping Lily fed and housed and happy was the whole of it." He looked out the window at his daughter, who was now demonstrating something to the largest sunflower with the conviction of a professor. "It's not the whole of it." "No," she agreed. He looked back at her. "I love you." He said it the way he said everything that mattered, flat on the surface, everything underneath, said because it was true and not for any other reason. "I've been figuring out how to say that for about 4 months. That's how I say it, apparently." She had known it was coming. She had felt it coming for weeks, in the texture of ordinary evenings, in the way he handed her coffee, in the way he was standing right now, and she still found, when he said it, that her chest did something that was completely involuntary and absolutely not managed. "I love you too," she said. "I've known that longer than I've admitted it." He nodded. Neither of them moved for a moment. This was, she thought, exactly right. This specific kitchen, this specific evening, no grand gesture, no perfect moment, just two people who had taken the long way to each other telling the truth. He said, "Lily is going to be extremely smug. She's earned it. She's 9. She's been planning this since October. She's absolutely earned it." He turned back to the stove, adjusted the heat. She came and stood next to him and looked at what he was making. Pasta, naturally. In this household it was always eventually pasta. And the kitchen settled back into the warm ordinariness of itself. The back door opened and Lily came in. She looked at the stove. She looked at Victoria standing beside Ethan. She looked at the two of them with the ancient, knowing assessment of a child who has wanted something to happen and watched it happen through sheer force of patient waiting. She said nothing. She went to the refrigerator, got out the juice, poured herself a glass, put the juice back. Then, on her way out of the kitchen, without turning around, she said, "I knew it." And she was gone, back to her sunflowers. Ethan and Victoria stood in the kitchen, and neither of them laughed, exactly. But the thing that moved through both of them was close enough to laughter to count. Here is what nobody tells you about rebuilding your life after it breaks. It is not a dramatic thing. The movies will tell you it is. The single moment, the grand speech, the scene where all the pieces click into place and the music swells. It does not happen that way. It happens in a kitchen on a Saturday while something is on the stove. It happens in a backyard in the dirt with your hands in the soil. It happens in a parking lot after a long day when you say to someone, "I'm not good at this either, but I'm willing to try." It happens incrementally, in the small decisions. The decision to pull over on a highway in a storm for someone who wronged you. The decision to verify the truth even when it is inconvenient. The decision to say I was wrong out loud and mean it. The decision to let someone see you without the armor on. These are not dramatic choices. They barely feel like choices at the time, but they accumulate, and what they build is not the same as what was there before. It is different, harder and softer at the same time, more honest, more aware of what it cost. Ethan Mercer lost his job and didn't fall apart, not because he was invulnerable, but because he had learned from years of holding things up alone, from loss, from the particular education of raising a child by yourself, that falling apart was a luxury you sometimes couldn't afford, and that if you did the next right thing and the thing after that, the shape of what you were building eventually became visible. He was not a perfect man. He held too much inside. He took too long to ask for help. He told himself that keeping people at a safe distance was protection, when sometimes it was just fear wearing practical clothing. Victoria Sterling was given power young and used it badly once, and had the particular grace to see it clearly and do something about it. She was not a warm person by nature. She had been made less warm by years of learning that warmth was a liability in rooms where everyone was waiting for you to fail. She managed herself like a company, and what she was learning, slowly, imperfectly, was that a life required more than management. It required presence. The willingness to be in the room fully, not as the version of yourself that is acceptable in public, but as the actual version, the one that didn't know what to do with the specific ache of being truly seen. What they gave each other was not rescue. Neither of them needed rescuing, and the story would be smaller if that were what it was. What they gave each other was more ordinary and more valuable than that. They gave each other the experience of being known, the real kind, not the performed kind, and finding that the actual self, unmanaged, is enough, is more than enough, is in fact the only thing that anyone ever really had to offer anyone else. On an evening in late summer, when the sunflowers were at their full height, and the tomatoes had made their peace with existence, and the kitchen light was doing what it always did, that warm, forgiving yellow. The three of them ate dinner at the table where a lot of things had happened over the past year, and they talked about Lily's upcoming school year, and a book Victoria had been reading, and the Memphis Hub's Q3 numbers, which Ethan brought up, and Victoria pointed out was a dinner table violation that she was letting go this once, and Lily demonstrated the whistle she'd finally learned from her friend Maya, which was surprisingly loud. Afterward, Lily helped clear the table without being asked, which was now her habit rather than an occasion, and then she went to do her homework, and the kitchen settled. Ethan stood at the sink washing dishes. Victoria stood next to him, drying them, in the specific rhythm that two people developed when they'd done a thing enough times that it no longer required thought. Outside, through the window, the sunflowers stood tall in the last of the evening light, their faces turned toward a sun that had nearly set, patient and enormous, and exactly what Lily had promised they would be. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Victoria set down the dish she was drying and looked out the window and said, "She was right." "About what?" "All of it." She paused. "They're really tall." Ethan looked at the sunflowers. He thought about a morning in October, a school parking lot, a small hand holding on, 5 more minutes, please don't go yet. He thought about what those 5 minutes had cost him and what they had, in the end, set in motion. I thought about how the worst thing that happened to you was sometimes the door to the best thing, not because the universe was tidy and just and arranged for your benefit, but because you were, in spite of everything, still capable of walking through a door. "Yeah," he said, "she was right." The dishes were done. The sunflowers held their ground outside in the last light. Somewhere down the hall, Lily was probably not doing her homework, and was instead researching something about Rome or garden science or the migratory habits of birds. And she was fine. She was completely and entirely fine. And the kitchen was warm, and the house was full, and everything that had been broken was not fixed exactly. You didn't fix loss. You didn't fix the years of going it alone. You didn't fix what fear cost you while you were doing it. But it was mended. The seam was visible, but it held. That was enough. More than enough. That was when you understood it clearly, everything.